This is the story of any day in Newcastle. Newcastle is 100 miles north of Sydney at the mouth of the Hunter River. It's one of the busiest ports in the country.
Hello, I'm Carol Duncan and welcome to the Lost Newcastle podcast. With more than 70,000 members, Lost Newcastle has become the online meeting place for generations of Novocastrians, sharing photos, stories, finding lost friends and loved ones, and learning plenty of new things about this place we call home. Whether you're a local, an expat, or new to Newcastle, grab a cuppa and enjoy. In this episode, I catch up with Rick Pointon, whose long career in both radio and the music industry has seen him write a brilliant book full of stories and anecdotes about the brilliant music history of a city. Join me as Rick regales you with tales of the 10-pound poms, legendary Newcastle venues like the Impala, the Cavern, Henry Mousetraps, the Palais and the Savoy, Bus Stop, Rayford's Records, and his own Benny and the Jets, who at their peak were doing more than 300 nights a year. Sandra, the Go-Go Girl, and just why did Barry Gibb make a secret trip to Newcastle in 1963? Newcastle is full of myths and legends, and the music industry is no different. But now you can hear these tales straight from someone who was there. It is so good to see you, Rick Pointon. How are you doing?
I'm good, Carol. Thank you very much.
I first met you, a few decades ago, working in radio.
Yep. Yeah, I've worked in radio a lot. 2HD, 2KO, 2KY, and finally 2NURFM.
So, KY Country.
Yes. And racing in those. I was only there a year, but yeah, it was interesting.
It was doing racing?
2K.
You're a music man. That must have driven you mad.
I know, it did. I didn't like that.
I can't imagine it pleased you all that much. Radio gets you in, doesn't it? Like liquid into this chalk.
I love radio. It was great.
Yeah. Would you do it again?
It's all changed, though.
Yeah.
You know. I really liked it, but I did a lot of other things in radio, like writing commercials and voicing commercials and things like that. So I never really did an on-air shift like you as such, I did segments, like a rock and roll segment each Saturday and things like that. And sometimes I'd sit in with various people, like I sat in with Art Ryan.
Popper.
Yeah, weekly when he was at 2HD and did a segment. But I've never done a shift like you do. No, not totally.
It was fun. I think all aspects of it were fun. Yeah. But a lot has changed. A lot of it has changed for the better,
it has.
to be honest. But I think for you and for me, I think that common thread right through those parts of our careers has been a love of music. You as a professional, me just because I love it.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Can't play an instrument. I wish I could, but I can't.
Doesn't matter. I mean, I couldn't imagine life without music, and I'm a silly record collector, CD collector, so it just was the natural thing.
How many you got?
Well, hard to say, but I recently sold 30,000, and I've still got a whole room full with all four walls, ceiling to floor. But the room is things that I play or I might play, but the 30,000 I sold were ones that I was attempting to go through. And anyway, a guy came up from Sydney that's got a big business and bought a truckload. So Helen reckons I've got too many, but you can never have too many.
Yeah, I don't know about
every salvos might have that one you're looking for.
You never know, do you?
You never know, Carol.
You just got to pop in and have a look just in case that piece of gold is in there. Who was young Rick Pointon? What were you interested in? What path did your career follow to both radio and with a love of music and performance?
It's funny, I just fell into things. And after high school, I didn't do well. I went to Newcastle Boys High, but I didn't do that well. And, Mum and Dad said, you might as well have a look around. And they saw something in the newspaper, and I was 15 and 1 month. And I went and applied and got the job. So, and in those days, it was called junior clerk. Uh-huh. But you got the lunches, you got the newspapers for everyone, you got their dry cleaning, and you got their, it was in a shipping company. But it was interesting because I used to have to go down to Lee Wharf and get the ship's papers from the master, take them to the customs house, enter the ship. And it was interesting. And so there was always 4 or 5 ships coming and going. And so I just fell into that. And then I was there about 5 years, and I tried an accountants that I hated because accountancy, I couldn't do it, you know.
Yes.
I wasn't for accountancy. And then I worked at the NRMA for a while, and I've always had a day job. I've never just done music, right or wrongly. And then I bought a record shop in Swansea for 10 years, from 74 to 83.
Yeah.
Before I went into the media. So I just, a record shop was the obvious thing for me, collecting records and then playing music, all day long. I was playing Eagles and ELO and Doobie Brothers, and I thought, that's pretty good.
I was going to say, that era, that decade there that you've had that shop, there's some prime stuff been released at that point.
You're spot on. The 70s for albums, like 60s were huge. I love 60s. 60s were huge for singles and hits.
Yeah.
70s albums, America, Seals and Crofts, you name it. It was brilliant time. I just put on an album I liked, and so often people would say, oh, what's that? I'll buy that. And it was just lovely talking to people about music.
Yeah. I think I did a similar thing. In high school, I did work experience at Powderworks Records.
Oh, did you?
In Brookvale, in Sydney, when they were, because I wanted to know everything about how it worked.
Yeah.
So I did work experience there as Midnight Oil's Bird Noises EP was being pressed. Which blows my kids' minds. And then I went to do work experience at 2SM, which was then the number one Sydney radio station.
Yep.
That was super cool. And then into Albert Studios, the old Albert Studios in King Street with Vander and Young.
That's right, you told me. Jeez, that's incredible.
Isn't it?
I mean, Vander and Young.
Because I just wanted to know how stuff worked. They had a computer. They had one of the very first Fairlight computers invented in Australia to use in the studio, and they had taught it or programmed it to say swear words.
Yeah, geez, they wrote some hits and produced some hits, didn't they, Vander and Young?
Yeah, hello, AC/DC, and just John Paul Young, everybody else. Everybody. Yeah. I've talked about that before, actually. That era of the £10 POM to Australia gave us a music industry.
I thought of writing a book, actually, after my book. I thought of writing a book called Australian Music and the £10 POMs. But, I mean, even recently, so many, Broderick Smith.
Oh, yeah.
£10 POM.
Yeah, Valet Brod.
Almost everybody, Masters, Apprentices, Glenn Shorrock.
Barnsey. I had this conversation once with Joe Camilleri, who pulled me up and he said, but I'm from Malta and I only cost £5.
£10 Malteser.
yeah. So it really was an amazing era. So was it from the record store that you went to media?
Yep.
Why?
Well,
I reckon I can start to hear Art Ryan getting involved.
Yes,
right, okay.
Spot on, actually. I did the shop, and while I had the shop, Art and I were involved in the Beating Around the Bush Channel 3 TV show.
Yep.
And I've always been in touch with Art, spoke to him yesterday. A couple of people asked me, did I want to sell the shop? And I hadn't thought about it, but I thought, and I was playing, at that point, Benny and the Jets was ridiculously busy. We were playing over 300 nights a week. A year.
300 nights a year.
No, you wouldn't. We were playing well over 300 nights a year. Now, 2 of the guys in the band gave up their jobs and they just played golf during the day and played in the band at night. But I always kept the shop going. So I was working all day, working all night, nearly all year. And Art said, you should think about radio. And he said, 2KO's looking for somebody. I went in there and had a word. David Mully was the manager. I ended up going to 2KO as promotions manager. And I was there for 2 years, and then I got an offer to go to 2HD, where I was for about 14 years. So, I fell into it like that. Art sort of pushed me and prodded me and probably helped me behind the scenes. Good times in radio in the 70s, 80s. It was.
Speaking of imports, though, Rick Pointon, you're one.
Yeah, definitely.
£10?
£10. Yep.
What made your family come here?
Well, my dad used to work in the potteries in Staffordshire, where they made all the pottery.
Oh my goodness! Yep.
Dad was manager of a pottery works. In the war, Dad had a few injuries and had malaria and a few other worse things, and he was a rat of Tobruk, and he got shipped out of Tobruk, sent to Alexandria Hospital to recover, and then they sent him to Burma and dropped him behind the Japanese lines with 10 men, and he had to go around blowing up railroads. And so he eventually got back to England in pretty bad shape.
Yeah.
Mum was his nurse. They had an allocated bed, and I don't know whoever came. Anyway, Mum looked after Dad, and they got married, and he was in the potteries, and he always had trouble with his lungs after the war. And a doctor said to Dad, if you don't get to a warmer climate, you won't be alive by the time you're 50, if you don't get to a better. I mean, the place we used to live at the time, near Stoke-on-Trent, the sky was just black from all the pottery kilns.
Yeah.
You see photos and there's like 50 pottery kilns and the sky was black, and you get on a bus and everyone's coughing into their handkerchiefs, and 50-year-old men were dying, like my grandfather, from silicosis. So Mum and Dad were sitting there one night, and on came a little thing about Bondi Beach at Christmas and everyone on the beach, and I said, let's go. So that was it.
Unimaginably massive decision to make, I reckon.
I don't think I could do it, Carol. We had a huge family, Dad's mum, and a huge family. Dad had brother, sister, really close family, and I can still remember them sending us off at Stoke railway station, and we came out to Australia, didn't know a soul. I don't know how they did it, but it turned out great, and
It boggles my mind, and to think about families that have come before them. Communication was still, you were lucky if you were able to send a telegram or book a phone call to make overseas. Even when I was a kid in the 70s. But, for generations that have come before us and before yours, indeed, it must have been like stepping off the end of the earth for some families.
Would have been horrendous. And some of them, of course, came out on sailing ships. But, look, when Mum and Dad had no money, and when they got here, the job that Dad was promised wasn't forthcoming. 2 weeks in, they had £20 left.
Yeah.
Because the job wasn't there. He was promised a job, and just wasn't there.
That must have been incredibly worrying. How many of you came over?
4 kids.
Four kids.
Mum and Dad and 4 kids.
Okay.
I wouldn't change it. We wouldn't change it. And Mum and Dad...
your parents must have been having kittens at that point. We've got £20 left, that's it.
Early on, it must have been horrible.
Yeah.
For a year, we lived in a weekender at Elibana. No toilet, no sewer, and 4 of us in a little outside sort of veranda. Whereas in England, we had a 2-storey council house, upstairs toilet, downstairs toilet, TV.
Did you have 2 dunnies when you were a kid?
Yeah.
Get out.
I know.
I've still only got one.
Well, you only need one, but it was a council house, but it was a newer one.
Yeah. Rick Pointon, you released a book.
Yep.
Last year called Hey Rock and Roll. And when I heard that you were doing this book, I just thought, it'll be a little book, soft cover, sort of, you pick it up at your newsagent. It's a whopper.
It's a doorstop.
It is a doorstop, and it's massive. Why did you want to write this book?
It's funny, people always said you should write a book. People had asked me a story about playing with the Bee Gees or Johnny O'Keefe or Col Joy, who I was good friends with, and they'd say, you should put this story in a book. And that was going on for years. But there was 2 or 3 people that I was really annoyed because they did so much for Newcastle music and never, ever had a mention.
Who?
Well, there was Reg Mason. You'd remember Reg Mason. He managed one of my bands, a band called The Second Thoughts, and he was a manager of Rayford's Records, and then he had his own shop called Impact Sound. And Reg, and he had a disco upstairs in the 2HD Winter Garden called Henry Mousetraps. What a groovy name. and Reg used to manage a few bands, and he really helped my band at the time and got us a record contract. But he did a lot for Newcastle. He actually, I think you could say, was the founding father of the Koalas, the Marching Koalas.
Oh, okay. Yep.
A lot of people don't know. And I've never read anything about him. And Freddie Pears, who owned the Palais, and the Savoy, and Remtex. Not that that's musical, but Fred was a lovely guy. No one ever wrote much about him. I went and spoke to Fred's daughter Sue, and I spoke to Reg's wife, and no one had ever sought them out. And a bloke that sort of no one remembers much except kids that went to the venues, called Ted van der Landen. Now, Ted was a Dutchman and came to Australia when he was in his teens, and he operated more Newcastle venues for bands than anybody. In Wolf Street,
Do you have a lost
we used
Newcastle
to
story to
play
tell?
at the
Get in
Impala,
touch. I'm Carol
the
Duncan,
Cavern,
and you
which was
can be part of the
upstairs
story
next to
too
the
at
Lyric.
lostnewcastle.com.au or join us on
the biggest
Facebook
one
and
down
Instagram.
the West End, not far from here, it's in that big Salvo's store. That was a disco called Bus Stop. Now,
Is that where that was?
Bus Stop was
Ha.
there. It was a car showroom.
Yeah.
It was voted 3 years in a row, I believe, through Go Set magazine, Australia's best live venue. I mean, we played there with people like Billy Thorpe when the windows were moving in and out, and the window. Ted was worried the windows were going to smash. Doug Parkinson, Masters Apprentices, you name it. Everybody killed to play at Bus Stop. 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 sometimes packed in. A lot of blues bands like Chain, La-Di-Da's. Incredible venue. So Ted had all of those. No one had ever written a word about him, I don't think. And he lived up the coast for a while, but I tracked him down and we caught up after 50 years. And he was just in tears, actually. He couldn't believe that anyone would go to the trouble to find him and then write something.
Oh, gosh.
His family are the same. Tim, Ted's son, Tim, is in touch with me regularly, and they're just so grateful. So was Reg Mason's wife, because he'd never received any accolades, and they should. But Ted, there's a couple of brilliant stories about Ted in the book, and with Barry Gibb, and Barry Gibb's secret trip to Newcastle, which has never been written about.
Do tell.
Well, in 1963, Ted came up from Melbourne, and opposite the Nine Ways, he had a little, wouldn't even be a cafe, call it a cafe, a hamburger joint, very small, opposite the Century Theatre, the great old Century Theatre. It's a pity that's not still there, isn't it? And it was, anyway, Ted had this little old cafe, and one night, about 10:30, Barry Gibb wanders in, followed closely by Robin and Morris. Ted says, he told the story so beautifully, he said Barry was really respectful and lovely, and Barry said, excuse me, sir, we're a singing group, you probably don't know us, and called the Bee Gees, and Ted couldn't remember whether he'd heard about them at that stage, but they said, we've been at the Century Theatre, we've just finished a concert with Johnny O'Keefe and a few other acts, I think Dig Richards and maybe Judy Stone, and he said, we've just finished that concert and we've driven up from Sydney, not in their car, I think they got a lift with somebody, and he said, when we went out the front, the foyer, to be paid, the promoter had left town with all the money. And this happened a fair bit back in those days.
Yeah.
I've never heard of it these days, but happened a fair bit. So there's not only Johnny O'Keefe and the Bee Gees and everybody and no money. So Barry said to Ted, we haven't eaten all day and we've been on the road, and he said they looked terrible. He said they were wringing wet, and Barry said, you wouldn't happen to have any, bits of chips or something that you're about to throw out. It's late at night.
Oh.
And he said, you couldn't spare us. So Ted sat them down, rustled up a hamburger, and he said they ate that instantly, and he could see they were still hungry. And so he said, you stay here. He left them in his little cafe, and he ran a few doors up the road to a fish and chip shop, because he knew that them being 10-pound poms, he knew they'd love fish and chips. So he came back with this Newcastle Herald full of fish and chips.
Yeah.
And he said they sat there and ate half of it, and they were thanking him profusely, and he said they were lovely. And that they would be, because I spent a bit of time with Barry, and he's a lovely person, genuine, lovely person. Anyway, they thanked Ted profusely. They left, and off they went to conquer the world.
Yeah.
And Anyway.
And they did.
And they did. And that's a great story, but there's more. Directly opposite where his little cafe was, Ted had moved on long ago. He had the 3 or 4 discos, and they finished up, I think Bus Stop closed in early 70s, and then Ted did some other things. Ted didn't ever make any money out of it. People ripped him off. He had to pay back all the debts. People left him with debts in some of these places, and he made sure he paid the debts off. In 1977, directly over the road, Sandra, I still call her Sandra the Go-Go Girl.
I'm sure she adores that at this point.
I hope you're listening, Sandra. Anyway, Sandra Elias, her name was, I remember. There was Sandra and Gay, and I've got quite a few photos of Sandra and Gay. They were our favourite Go-Go girls on the back of the 2HD fire engine in the Matara procession.
That's fantastic.
Isn't that a great photo?
Yeah. Oh, my Lord.
The old 2HD had an old fire engine they used to use on promotions.
Yeah.
Anyway, Ted used to have, the listeners, you've probably seen the old Get Smart episodes where they go to a disco and there's cages hanging from the ceilings and there's these girls gyrating madly in the cages, and Denise Drysdale used to be one that used to do it on Band.
Oh, Ding Dong.
Ding Dong,
Yep.
on The Go Show and all those. Sandra and Gay, our two favourite Go-Go girls, they used to dance. In fact, Art Ryan's daughter used to dance at the Palais in one of the cages, I think.
Nicole,
I think.
why doesn't that surprise me?
It doesn't surprise you, does it? Anyway, Ted had 2 cages strung up at the Cavern, and I think the Palais had a couple eventually. So Sandra, the Go-Go Girl, was standing opposite where Ted's shop used to be at the main bus stop at the Century Theatre. Mm-hmm. And this limo pulls up, and she thought, gee, that looks like Barry Gibb, probably, because it was Barry Gibb, and Barry, darkened window, Barry winds down the window and he calls Sandra over. He said, sorry, excuse me, this is a really long shot. You would never have heard of a bloke called Ted Vander something Land. And she said, oh, yeah, Ted, of course, he's a good friend. What's the chance of that happening? Mm. So he said, he used to have a little cafe here. And she said, oh, yeah, long ago. And Barry's still sitting in the car and Sandra's bending down at the window. And he said, what did he do? And she said, oh, well, he had all these other little discos and they all eventually closed. And Barry said, here's another thing, you wouldn't know where Ted lived. And she said, yeah, I do actually. He was just over at Mayfield East, about 5 minutes away. So,
oh, tell me she hopped in the limo.
So she hopped in the limo.
Yes!
And in between Barry and the lovely Linda, she was Miss Edinburgh and she was a real stunner. In fact, at that point, Barry and Linda would have been what they'd now call the hot couple in the world. Yeah. They were in all the papers and all the, the movie premieres and stuff. Anyway, so
we're in the limo. We're going to Mayfield.
And she takes them over to Mayfield.
Uh-huh.
Now, Ted's house, if Tim was listening, you wouldn't mind me saying, was a little, very inconspicuous, small cottage. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's so old, it was made out of sandstone blocks, like the original old 1 foot thick sandstone blocks. So it was very old. Ted came to the door and he was a bit befuddled. He couldn't quite work out what was going on. So Barry gave him a big, cuddle. And he looked over Barry's shoulder and there's Linda and, looking like they'd stepped out of a movie. And there's Sandra.
Sandra, the Go-Go Girl.
The Go-Go Girl. So, hello, Sandra, Ted, Barry Gibb. So they all went in and sat down. And Ted said, what are you doing here? You're touring. Ted was a bit befuddled. And he said, are you touring Australia? And Barry said, no. I've come to see you. And he said, yeah, but I mean, are you doing TV or something? He said, no, I've come to see you. And he said, we had a week off. And he said, Robin and Morris have gone to the Bahamas and I've come to Newcastle. And Ted thought he was sort of joking or something. And he said, yeah, but I'm not doing anything else, Ted. I've got to go back to Sydney tonight. But he said, Ted was just staggered. And then Barry presented him with a gold watch.
Oh, gosh.
To Ted, thank you so much blah, blah, blah. And at that very point, I think the Bee Gees had 7 or 8 of the American top 10. And the same here and the same all over the world. And what the Bee Gees didn't sing in the top 10, they'd written.
Yeah.
And there's Barry at Mayfield giving a watch to Ted. And, you know, Ted was really choked up. And Barry said, listen, we haven't got... They've been there for a little while. He said, I've always told Linda how much we love coming to Newcastle to play because we love the beaches. You couldn't show us around the beaches, could you? So Ted was doing up his old Monaro. They left the other car, they jumped in the Monaro and went up to... And at Nobby's Beach, the police pulled them over.
Yeah.
And police comes to the window, so Barry tries to slide down and look inconspicuous. And the policeman says, excuse me, sir, your taillights aren't working. And Ted said, he said, look, officer, that wouldn't surprise me. I was working on the car. I'm really sorry. I didn't even intend to bring it out tonight. And the policeman stopped talking and said, is that Barry Gibb? And of course Barry could hear it. And Barry said, weighing down, hello. And he said, oh, boy, autograph. And he said, you wouldn't want a police escort. Where are you going now? And Ted said, well, I was showing Barry and Linda the beaches. They've got to go back to Sydney. You need a police escort. So off they went, up to Bar Beach, up to Merriweather. And
fantastic.
I thought, how lovely. And later on, towards the end of Bus Stop Disco, when it was closing, some lowlife stole all of Ted's memorabilia, including the Bee Gees watch. What a great story. And so that was Ted Vanderland, and I've written a few stories about him, and a lot of people have contacted me about that, and Johnny O'Keefe has got Johnny O'Keefe stories in there, Little Richard.
Yeah, the incredibly notorious Little Richard story. I'm going to give you time for one more story. What do you want to tell? Do you want to tell the Little Richard one?
Well,
or do we all know that well enough now? You choose.
Because
this book is chock-a-block full of stories, and if you love your Newcastle local history and or music history, you will dig this book.
Thank you.
You choose a story.
Well, I mean, yeah, the Little Richard thing has been in the news a lot lately, and Johnny O'Keefe. Are you sick of the Little Richard story?
No, because it is one of those incredible Newcastle stories that people think is a myth and will continue to... It's like Groundhog Day.
Yeah.
Every year it comes up.
Yeah, every 3 or 4 months somebody writes in somewhere into Lost Newcastle or somewhere and says, is that true, Little Richard?
Yeah,
you know.
It's like the number of people who still believe that the bottom of the children's pool, the canoe pool, still has a map of the world.
Yes.
And let's all get together this weekend with shovels and dig it out. There's no map there anymore.
Yeah,
people.
Right.
It hasn't been for 50
it?
years. And what's the other? Oh, that, you know, people have no idea. There is a swimming pool, baths, under the old Civic Arcade.
City Arcade. Yeah.
No, you can't get down there, but it is still there.
Yeah, incredible.
Okay, Little Richard, let's go.
Little Richard, I've always bought books about music, and in the 70s, I was reading a book about Little Richard, and it said, of course, Little Richard did quit show business for a while and became a minister, and he threw his jewellery off the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Now, I knew that wasn't true.
How did you know that was not true, Rick Pointon?
Well...
Because some people think that's true.
Yeah, I know, but... name dropping, my friend Johnny O'Keefe was there and witnessed the whole thing.
Okie dokie, that's a pretty good source, isn't it?
I know. Well, it's happened. That's now become, my story in the book becomes the final thing about it. Like, I've had writers from America ask me, can they, because in the book, I've got the letter from Johnny O'Keefe explaining it.
Yeah.
Because I said to him, I said, that can't be right. You were there. He said, oh, yeah, I know. I said, well, I've had these people from America ask him. He said, tell you what, I'll send you a letter. I just, not that long ago, gave the OK for an American author to use my letters because I'm happy for it to be corrected.
Yeah.
And it's always Sydney Harbour Bridge or Sydney Harbour. People have said they saw him throw it off the Carrington Bridge. I mean, like you said, there's all these myths. Johnny O'Keefe told me about it. It was October 1957, and it was the second rock and roll tour of Australia. Bill Haley was first, and this was Little Richard, Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran, Alice Leslie, who was billed as the female Elvis Presley, and very young Johnny O'Keefe.
Yeah.
He hadn't even had his first hit then. So he wasn't a big star.
Now, as I understand it, this
Yeah.
started, was it on the trip to Australia, on the plane?
Yeah, well, yes. It seems crazy now, but in 1957, churches and people were saying that rock and roll was the devil's music and the world is going to hell and all this. And Little Richard came from a very, very religious, Southern Baptist type family. And he kept threatening to go into the ministry. And Billy Graham, the evangelist, was huge, and he was up on the podium saying, rock and roll is the devil's music. So Little Richard was talking about it on the plane. And on the plane from Adelaide to Melbourne, one of the engines was glowing, he said, and Little Richard thought the plane was going to crash, but there was never any problem. But he said, the Lord will save me. And anyway, he said, if I live through this, I'll give it up. So when they were in Newcastle, they were in a bus. There was a bus picked them up at Williamtown, and they were driving onto the punt. And when they were on the punt, Little Richard said, I'm quitting show business and I'm going to serve the Lord. Something like that, probably better.
Something like that, yes.
Johnny O'Keefe in the letter to me, he said, in his way of speaking, Little Richard, but Johnny O'Keefe used to take off Little Richard really good. I'm quitting show business. So his bass player, he said, if you're quitting show business, Little Richard, you should throw all your jewellery away. So with that, he chucked all his jewellery in the harbour. And they went and did the show at the Newcastle Stadium, which is where Market Town is now. Johnny O'Keefe said they were a bit concerned what the show would be like because Little Richard was going on about giving it a miss. But he said it was the best show, Little Richard, that he ever saw him do on that tour. He said it was great. So that's the truth of it. And as Johnny says in the letter to me, if you're speaking to any of the American musicologists or historians, please make sure that it's corrected to read Newcastle. And as you know, I was hassling you to see if we could get a statue on the foreshore or something. I tell you what, it would be great. The Bee Gees have got a huge memorial in Redcliffe. And
Bond's got one in
Bond's
Western
got
Australia.
in Fremantle.
Yeah.
I'm telling you what, it would be enormous for Newcastle. If you had the statue of Little Richard, Johnny O'Keefe, Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran, say, I could just see tourists, honestly, I could just see tourists lining up to get a photo with the statue.
Uh-huh. I'll talk to the Lord Mayor.
Please, yeah. I'm happy to go to any meetings.
I know.
I tried 25 years ago and it fell on deaf ears, but I'm persistent.
Yeah, there's a few statues that I get asked about occasionally. So there's a request for a Joey Johns statue. There's a few. Anyway, noted. I think when you've actually got that correspondence from JOK,
that nails it.
Who was there with him? That's your evidence. Yeah. That's all the provenance you need.
Pat Barton was there too. You'd remember Pat.
I do remember Pat.
He was there too. He told me about it.
Yeah.
That's exactly how it happened.
So every time I watch the David Allen up and down the port, up and down the dredge, up and down the port and dumping off the coast, I'm just like, where's the jewellery?
Yeah. 10 miles out or something, But yeah.
Where's the bling?
But it's a great story and it's the only, as Johnny O'Keefe said, it's the only city in the world that can claim that story. And it's written about in dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of books, but it always says Sydney Harbour Bridge.
Yeah.
Good, it sounds better, I suppose.
Rick Pointon, it's been a real pleasure to catch up with you.
Enjoyed it.
And to have some stories for you. Maybe we should do some more from the book another 6 months and share them around occasionally. It's a big, thick book, and it's chock-a-block full of stories and photos and just incredible tales. But a lot of these people are people that I know my parents loved listening to and loved seeing perform live. But your career through music goes into, that time where I became a little tiny baby music fan when you were doing gigs with Sherbet and so on. Yeah. So there's that really gorgeous crossover there. And as I mentioned right at the start, Rick, I reckon anybody who enjoys Lost Newcastle, enjoys a little bit of local history, or if you're a music history fan and you want to know how Newcastle became a musical city, your book.
Thank you so much.
It's a cracker. Where do we get it?
Well, it's in most news agencies, a lot, most of them, and most of the bookshops.
Yeah.
Without naming anybody, so it shouldn't be hard to find.
And you're in Lost Newcastle as well,
Yep.
so people can always
Yep.
send you a message there.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much
No,
for your
thank you,
time.
Carol. I've enjoyed it.